April 1945. The war in Europe is collapsing, but the fear in Germany is only rising. A narrow road cuts through the quiet countryside outside Hamburg, a place where spring should mean birdsong and new leaves. Instead, it is the sound of engines that fills the air. British armored carriers roll forward, metal clattering, mud snapping beneath steel tracks as they advance deeper into territory that had once seemed untouchable. On the roadside, a group of German women stand frozen. Some hold children tight. Others clutch small suitcases, the last pieces of a life reduced to what a person can carry. Their husbands are gone to the front. Their towns have been bombed. No one had prepared them for this moment, the sight of soldiers they had been taught to fear. The British troops dismount in silence. Boots crunch. Rifles rest, but remain ready. The air feels sharp, suspended between violence and mercy. One woman, mid-30s, dust on her shoes and a red scarf around her hair, stares directly at the closest British soldier. Not with hatred, not entirely with terror, but with the raw uncertainty of someone who realizes that everything she has been told may no longer be true, because this is the first time German women stand face to face with the men they once called the enemy, and this encounter is only beginning. By early 1945, Germany was no longer a fortress. It was a collapsing nation. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Western Front, once held by the Wehrmacht with desperate resistance, was crumbling. British and Canadian forces moved swiftly through the north under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's command, aiming for ports, bridges, and communication hubs that the Germans could no longer defend. Millions of civilians were on the roads, refugees from the east fleeing the Soviet advance, families displaced by bombing raids, and women who had never imagined the fight would reach their small towns and farms. Railways lay shattered. Food was scarce. The sound of artillery echoed across landscapes where farms once thrived. Propaganda had shaped civilian expectations. German women had been warned. The Allies will take revenge. They will destroy everything. They will shame you. Radio broadcasts and Nazi party officials repeated the message. Fear was the final weapon of a government losing control. Women were told to avoid Allied troops at all costs, hide in basements, or flee into forests. Yet, as the British began their advance into northern Germany, hiding became impossible. April 1945. Areas around Bremen, Hamburg, and Hanover. British and Canadian armored divisions pressed into rural communities where few civilians had ever seen a foreign soldier. These soldiers were not starving or exhausted like many German troops. They were organized, well-supplied, and moving with a clear goal. End the war. Quickly. Behind them rolled columns of logistics vehicles, medics, military police, and communication units. This wasn't a raid. It was an occupation in progress. The German army still resisted in scattered pockets, but the fear among civilians was not about bullets. It was about the unknown. Stories from the East told of brutal vengeance. But the British were not the Red Army. Their orders, training, and cultural mindset were different. Yet the women did not know that. They waited, tense and silent, in the ruins of certainty. And as British reconnaissance reported civilians gathered along nearby roads, the first unplanned human contact was no longer a hypothetical. It was imminent and unavoidable. These encounters would not take place in government chambers or command tents. They would happen on dirt roads, in farmyards, beside bombed-out homes, where soldiers and civilians stood only a few feet apart, trying to understand what the other wanted. A moment where weapons, fear, and propaganda clashed with reality. A moment when two sides met not as ideologies, but as human beings. And that moment was now approaching. the rules for how Allied soldiers should treat. German civilians did not appear out of thin air. They were shaped by years of war and by what the Allies discovered as they advanced. By April 1945, British forces entering northern Germany were encountering evidence of Nazi oppression, concentration camps, forced labor sites, and civilian executions. Commanders emphasized discipline and restraint, but also vigilance. Every farmhouse, every barn could hide a sniper or a last-stand soldier refusing to surrender. Order of the day: maintain strict control. Avoid unnecessary violence. Prevent revenge or looting. Treat civilians firmly, but not cruelly. The Geneva Convention protected prisoners of war, but not civilians in an active combat zone. So British soldiers operated under occupation directives: disarm resistance, secure infrastructure, and establish authority over the population. Civilians were to be gathered, questioned, and kept away from military positions until areas were secure. German women suddenly found themselves under a foreign military system they did not understand. Many had spent years under a regime that promised protection, only to be abandoned as defeat closed in. They had been told British soldiers were barbarians, driven by a desire for punishment. But the soldiers they now saw were tired men, cautious but not brutal, more focused on ending the war than seeking revenge. And yet, fear does not disappear just because a rifle remains pointed down. British soldiers, too, carried uncertainty. Intelligence briefings warned them about Volkssturm militias, disguised combatants, and the possibility that women might hide armed sons or husbands. One casual slip of trust could lead to a soldier's death. So the first interactions were guarded, a careful dance of observation and control. Example unit formations in this advance included British 11th Armoured Division elements of the 7th Armoured Division, Desert Rats, Canadian units pushing alongside in some sectors. They secured towns, established checkpoints, and searched for remaining German fighters. Civilians were directed where to go, what to carry, and how to behave. In many communities, women outnumbered men by overwhelming proportions. Factories that once built engines and weapons were empty shells. Farm fields were abandoned. Schools stood silent. The Wehrmacht was gone, absorbed into a war they were losing day by dangerous day. So when British troops rolled into small villages and rural roads, they encountered not an organized civilian authority, but frightened women and children who no longer trusted their own leaders to protect them. All the pieces were in place for a human confrontation built on years of propaganda, fear, and silence. And now, finally, proximity. Because soon, British soldiers and German women would meet, with no barrier left between them. Human fear and expectation. For years, German women lived beneath the weight of Nazi warnings. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and officials insisted, "The British hate you. They will bring humiliation." Many families kept cyanide pills or homemade poisons, a final escape if the nightmares they expected arrived. Mothers whispered instructions to daughters: "Stay inside. Don't speak. Don't look them in the eye." Yet, when the British advance came, many women were standing outside. Not by choice, but because their homes were destroyed or evacuation orders forced them onto open roads. Clothing was worn thin from weeks of displacement. Hunger sharpened their nerves. Still, curiosity lingered beneath the terror. What did a British soldier truly look like? A monster, as propaganda claimed? Or just a man? The moment of contact became a test of fear versus reality that decades of ideological conditioning could not control. Tactical necessity and field protocols, every encounter carried danger. Training manuals warned British troops that the most harmless-looking civilian might hide a handgun. Or worse, a fanatic convinced that death was preferable to surrender. Women could act as messengers or scouts for retreating German units. Some Volkssturm fighters disguised themselves or used civilians as cover. Troops were instructed to separate groups, demand identification, conduct searches, and control movement. It wasn't aggression, it was survival. A checkpoint wasn't a welcome mat, it was a shield. Even as soldiers witnessed starving mothers and frightened children, discipline required distance. Rifles stayed visible. Orders were short and sharp. The line between compassion and caution was rigid, enforced by commanders who had seen too many patrols ambushed by those who looked harmless. Logistics, transport, and the speed of collapse. The rapid British advance was powered by functioning supply lines, fuel trucks, communication vehicles, armored transports. The war machine kept moving, leaving little time for emotional hesitation. Civilians on the roadside weren't a planned part of operations. They were obstacles in narrow lanes, forcing soldiers to slow down and engage. Disorganization in Germany meant no civilian authorities remained to guide or reassure the population. The British needed maps, bridges, and passage, and these terrified groups stood in the middle of all three. Field engineers repaired roads while infantry cleared safe routes. Signals units established communication posts in barns or schoolhouses, all while women watched foreign soldiers step into spaces once reserved for their own. The collapse of the German state wasn't abstract. It was visible in every frightened eye and every abandoned home that British troops passed. The era of separation was over, and direct human confrontation was now impossible to avoid. Leadership and orders from above British commanders understood that how their troops treated civilians would shape the post-war future. Discipline became a hallmark of the Western Allies, a deliberate contrast to what was unfolding in the East. Officers briefed their men before every push deeper into Germany. No looting. No unnecessary force. Maintain respect. Maintain order. This restraint wasn't simply humanitarian. It was strategic. Britain needed to secure ports, roads, communication centers, and prevent guerrilla warfare from erupting in newly occupied areas. A frightened civilian might comply, but a humiliated one could resist. Leadership insisted on calm professionalism. The success of the occupation depended on it. Still, no command could fully remove the unpredictability of human fear. The moment soldiers stepped off their vehicles, the decisions were personal, made face-to-face. Propaganda, perception, and the enemy image German women had been taught to imagine the British as merciless invaders. The Nazi propaganda machine portrayed Allied soldiers as criminals, fueled by hatred for the fatherland. Men who would burn, kill, and take what they wanted. This fear spread faster than any order could contain. Ironically, British intelligence also warned troops that German civilians might react violently to occupation, driven by the very propaganda that frightened them. Two groups, shaped by years of lies, now stood across from each other, each waiting for the other to prove the rumors true. The first words exchanged were more than greetings. They were collapses of entire belief systems. Eyes scanned uniforms, faces, and hands for signs of cruelty. But instead of brutality, many German women saw exhaustion and caution, ethics, and the weight of responsibility. Occupation blurred rules into shadows. Geneva protections were clear for POWs, but civilians under army authority lived in a legal gray zone. Every decision a British soldier made, a raised voice, a firm grip, a confiscated item, carried consequences. Behind fear were lives that still needed protection. Soldiers had to judge when to show strength and when to show compassion, knowing either choice could be misread. Some British troops quietly shared food or cigarettes when officers weren't looking. Others remained distant, afraid that kindness might weaken their guard. Ethics weren't theoretical. They were lived in seconds, with rifles between strangers who did not yet trust peace. The morality of war now rested not in sweeping strategies, but in brief encounters on broken roads. All 6 angles converged into a single reality. Two worlds, enemy and occupier, were about to collide in one defining human moment. April 19, 1945, outskirts of Winsen an der Luhe, south of Hamburg, a reconnaissance patrol from the 11th Armored Division advanced along a narrow rural road lined with abandoned carts and scattered belongings. The war diary of the division later recorded the landscape simply as thick with refugees. Intelligence had warned that retreating German soldiers might hide among civilians, particularly women. Patrol Commander Lieutenant Robert H. Clark ordered the unit to slow. A checkpoint was established at a crossroads where refugees were forced to pass through a controlled lane. There were no interpreters present. A group of roughly 20 German women approached with children gathered close behind them. The British troops raised hands, signaling them to stop. The order was simple: halt, disperse, move aside. But fear translates poorly without shared language. The women froze, whispering urgently among themselves. One stepped forward, arms raised, attempting to speak. Soldiers shouted again, louder this time. The fear sharpened. A British private, following protocol, moved to search a large suitcase being held by one of the women. When he reached for it, she resisted instinctively, pulling back with both hands. To her, it was all she had left. To him, it was a potential hiding place for a weapon. Rifles lifted. Children cried. The defenders of two collapsing worlds saw a single object, but with completely different meanings. Lieutenant Clark advanced quickly, speaking slower, calmer, a human voice cutting through chaos. He opened his hands to show he meant no harm. The women hesitated, but the suitcase was surrendered. Inside, children's clothes, a worn blanket, and a tin food container, empty. Clark then gave a signal: lower weapons. Keep vigilance. The tension held like a breath that refused to release. One British soldier noticed a teenage boy among the group, attempting to hide his right hand. Wrapped in cloth stained darker at the edges, he was pulled aside. The cloth was removed. A fresh burn mark. No rifle, no pistol. Only the scars of escape from a burning home. The soldiers exchanged glances, the kind that rewrite assumptions. This was not an ambush. This was survival. Yet discipline required action. Identities had to be checked. The women were directed to sit in a cleared area beside the road, while military police were called forward. A young mother pleaded silently as her toddler clung to her side, terrified of the uniformed men who now surrounded them. In that moment, the confrontation's energy shifted. These were not trained combatants. They were families, displaced, exhausted, starving. The British soldiers realized a truth that propaganda had hidden. This enemy did not want to fight. But even as tension faded, the consequences of misunderstanding remained. And they were not over. Because one small incident at a crossroads had already triggered military protocols above their heads. Protocols that would escalate the event beyond anyone's intention. When the military police arrived, they took control immediately. Their orders prioritized security. Any group encountered within recently occupied territory could conceal saboteurs or fleeing soldiers. The women were questioned individually, while soldiers scanned the woods and fields for signs of German troops. A British corporal noticed the red-scarfed woman, the one who had first stood at the roadside. She watched the soldiers with a stillness that made her seem unafraid, but her hands trembled each time a child whimpered. When asked for papers, she produced identification that showed her city of origin. Hamburg. Air raids there had erased entire neighborhoods. She and her neighbors were fleeing, not from battle, but from ruins. Yet suspicion lingered. Two women had no documents, a red flag in any war zone. They were separated from the group for further inspection. One carried a bundle wrapped beneath her coat. A British sergeant stepped forward cautiously, signaling her to hand it over. Fear broke into tears. She unwrapped not a weapon, but a tiny baby, asleep and weak from hunger. The soldiers looked at each other. The clarity of war blurred again. Still, authority demanded caution. The women were instructed to remain in place until additional units could confirm security. Hours passed under watchful eyes. Children sat in the dust beside ration tins and broken shoes. Soldiers tried to keep their faces stern. Order was their armor. But one could not resist offering his canteen to a crying boy. Another quietly handed the mother a biscuit when the sergeant wasn't looking. Humanity leaked through discipline. The real escalation came from the radio. A message crackled through, "Be alert. Civilians may be attempting to move wounded Wehrmacht personnel disguised in women's clothing. Treat all unidentified individuals as possible hostiles." That single instruction, delivered from far beyond the dirt road, changed the atmosphere instantly. The MPs regrouped the women and ordered them to remain seated with hands visible. A soldier stood behind each adult. The earlier calm interaction narrowed into a high-tension freeze. The German women did not know what had changed. They only saw weapons straighten, and fear returned like a storm. Lieutenant Clark confronted the MPs, arguing the group was harmless. But hierarchy ruled the situation. Clark's assessment was noted, not followed. Final judgment would come from divisional headquarters after interrogation and verification. As the sun began to set, transport trucks arrived to move the civilians to a temporary holding area closer to the command post. The women gathered their meager belongings. A few attempted nervous smiles at the soldiers who had shown quiet sympathy. But uncertainty swallowed every expression. The first contact had ended without violence. But it hadn't ended softly. It ended with control, restraint, and a growing realization, shared silently by both sides. They had been wrong about each other, yet the immediate question remained unresolved. What would come next? When an entire population met the occupying army, this small crossroads encounter was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The small crossroads encounter was recorded in the 11th Armored Division's war diary, noting the presence of approximately 20 female civilians with dependent children, no identifiable male combatants. British officers logged the event as a controlled civilian interaction, a routine engagement that nevertheless required the intervention of military police. Following protocol, the women were escorted to a temporary holding area near a commandeered schoolhouse. There, officers conducted identity checks, noting origins, ages, and familial status. Reports indicated that all 20 civilians were accounted for and posed no military threat, though 2 were held longer for document verification. No weapons or sabotage materials were found. The encounter demonstrated both the disciplinary control of British troops and the residual fear instilled in German civilians. Soldiers' post-action reports noted visible signs of starvation and fatigue, with one private remarking in his diary, "These women are frightened, not hostile, yet every movement feels like a test of nerves." This single event rippled through the immediate chain of command. The brigade headquarters issued a reinforcement directive. Units moving into towns should establish checkpoints at primary road intersections, record civilian presence, and report anomalies immediately. Intelligence officers emphasized maintaining vigilance, even among women and children, citing concerns about disguised retreating soldiers. The broader operational impact became clear over the following days. Patrols recorded hundreds of civilian encounters, many echoing the pattern established at Winsen an der Luhe. Women and children frozen in fear, soldiers enforcing order but exercising restraint. Logistic units reported delays caused by congested roads filled with displaced civilians. Engineering detachments rerouted armored columns to avoid unnecessary civilian contact while still advancing strategically. Official. Dispatches from the British Army noted the effectiveness of combining caution with humane treatment. emphasizing that controlling civilian populations without violence improved compliance and reduced resistance. At the divisional level, officers highlighted that early humane interactions might prevent partisan-style attacks, maintaining momentum in the northern advance. The first encounter had immediate consequences. No bloodshed, compliance achieved, and lessons logged for other units. But it also set the tone for how civilians and occupying forces would interact in the remaining days of the European campaign, introducing the human element into operational calculations. It was a small, controlled episode, yet it foreshadowed the larger, far-reaching consequences of occupation in a collapsing Germany. In the weeks following the initial encounter, the consequences extended beyond the immediate checkpoint. The British advance through northern Germany encountered thousands of displaced civilians, women, children, and the elderly. Each encounter echoing the lessons learned at Winsen and der Luhe. Command reports emphasized that humane treatment of civilians reduced resistance and improved intelligence gathering, allowing engineers, logistics, and reconnaissance units to operate with fewer obstacles. For German women, the first interactions with British soldiers reshaped perception. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal the internal conflict. Fear, bred by years of propaganda, confronted the reality of discipline, patience, and measured courtesy. Some women quietly thanked soldiers with gestures, a nod, a small smile, while others remained frozen, unable to reconcile the image of the enemy with the men in uniform standing before them. The experience left a lasting impression, recorded in letters and oral histories collected decades later. At a legal and administrative level, the British reinforced occupation policies derived from international law. Orders explicitly prohibited looting, enforced protection of civilians, and emphasized separation of non-combatants from operational zones. This adherence to Geneva principles created precedents for later military governance and influenced post-war occupation policy across Germany. Commanders noted that respect for civilian life maintained order, prevented incidents that could undermine political objectives, and reduce the likelihood of retaliatory attacks. Morale among soldiers was also affected. Reports show that soldiers experienced relief when civilian interactions ended without violence, and a cautious empathy emerged. Some officers documented small acts of kindness, distributing rations, or providing medical attention as necessary for operational success rather than charity. These actions humanized both sides and reinforced the psychological aspect of occupation strategy. The enduring human image from these encounters remains striking. Women, often alone with children, standing quietly in the dust, watching the uniforms pass. Soldiers maintaining vigilance while restraining instinctive reactions to fear and suspicion. It was an inversion of wartime expectations. The enemy was no longer an abstract, faceless threat. It was human, vulnerable, and capable of surrendering trust. The Crossroads encounter and the thousands that followed became emblematic of the WW2 final phase of the European campaign. A collision of ideology and reality, fear and restraint, collapse and continuity. It marked a transition from combat to occupation, where humanity and law intertwined in real time, shaping both immediate operations and the moral framework of post-war Europe. The stage was now set for reflection. The war was ending, yet the lessons of these moments, of fear, compassion, and discipline, would resonate long after the guns fell silent. The encounter between British soldiers and German women was more than a military checkpoint. It was a meeting of fear and curiosity, ideology and reality, expectation and human truth. In the final weeks of the European war, civilians were often invisible casualties. Yet here, they stood face to face with the men they had been taught to hate. And the soldiers saw not enemy combatants, but mothers, daughters, and children clinging to hope. Historically, These moments revealed a subtle but profound truth. Discipline and restraint could shape the outcome of occupation as decisively as artillery or armor. British adherence to international law and ethical conduct minimized violence, built compliance, and prevented unnecessary chaos. The tactical lesson was clear. War is not only fought with bullets and tanks, but also with judgment, patience, and humanity. For those German women, the memory of the first encounter lingered for decades. It was a collision of propaganda and lived reality, fear and empathy. In the larger scope of history, such moments remind us that even amid destruction, the human capacity for trust, mercy, and recognition persists. The war was ending, but these fleeting, tense interactions left an imprint on the moral and operational frameworks that would govern post-war Europe. And in that narrow country road outside Hamburg, where dust clung to weary shoes and a red scarf marked a woman's resilience, the first meeting had already begun to rewrite what it meant to confront an enemy, and to see them, finally, as human.